So I'm Katherine Ewing. I'm a professor in the religion department, although actually an anthropologist by training, and the director of the South Asia Institute. And I just want to mention a few things, a little bit of background. The South Asia Institute is a national resource center, and its programming is partially supported by the federal government's Department of Education as a result. And I'm really delighted that because of that, we are able to welcome you all today for our symposium, Climate Crisis in South Asia, Imagining Other Ways, which University Professor Gayatri, Chakravorty, Spivak, and I have put together. I want to thank each of our speakers for coming, as well as our co-sponsors, the Climate School, Department of Anthropology, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Society of Fellows in the Heyman Center for the Humanities. And most of all, the hardworking staff of the South Asia Institute. Associate Director William Carrick, Annapurna Schreiber, and student workers who are here helping us today, Samar Rashid Khan and Brock Walker. In 2022, we can't ignore the climate crisis that we're in the midst of. We need to be reminded that parts of Pakistan are still underwater from flooding that began way back in June. Once the waters finally recede, how will we remember? What actions will we, and whose we, take to reduce the impact of melting glaciers and monster monsoons on growing populations of vulnerable people who live along the Indus River? Or the people who live in villages that are becoming islands in the Bay of Bengal as they sink into a rising sea, a scene that I caught a glimpse of 15 years ago, and has been happening for, it's been obvious to some for a long time. How we remember and what we do to change things depends on what we see. And this depends on the stories we tell. A point that was also communicated to me by a member of our audience, Dr. Anjum Altaf, who wrote to me last night, appreciating our focus on stories. These stories include the histories we construct, tales of the people and forces that we blame, whom we call the perpetrators or victims and acknowledge or ignore. Stories also create the future. Scientists, technocrats, politicians, and corporations cannot solve problems that have not been recognized, and we recognize them through stories. Today, we are gathered to think about what the humanities can contribute to understanding how the world, and South Asia in particular, arrived at its current state of crisis, how this crisis is experienced, and how we can imagine a better way. What stories can we tell, for example, about the once sacred Indus River, which has taken thousands of lives this year? Historians tell us that the British colonial empire developed the Indus River, using its waters to create the world's largest irrigation system, dotting the Punjab and Sindh with canal colonies whose inhabitants are now at the mercy of the floods. Back in the 1970s, as I traveled through Sindh, I heard stories of the rising water table, rising because of all the irrigation, as the salty water poisoned the fields and threatened to submerge the remains of Mohenjo-daro, the ancient Indus Valley city and civilization. Unlike some of South Asia's rivers, most of the flow of the Indus comes from the snows and glaciers of the high mountains that frame South Asia's northern edge. In 2010, dramatic floods caused by what was then called a freak monsoon combined with summer meltwater and gave us a new story. A UN disaster relief expert, for example, Usman Ghazi, predicted that such floods would become more frequent and were one of Pakistan's biggest hazards. We see now how prescient he was. But there's more to the story. The melting glaciers will continue to swell the river for another quarter century of global warming. And then the waters will recede as the glaciers disappear. And even now, though the mighty Indus has flooded the country, it is normally sucked dry before it even reaches the sea. One of the stories told by novelist and journalist Alice Albinia, who traveled the 2,000-mile Indus River over 3 years, spending 3 years talking to people, listening to their stories about the river. Pakistan and northern India's extensive irrigation system depends on the Indus, and the population base is growing fast. China has dammed up the headwaters, and the river and its tributaries are shared by Pakistan and India. Competition over the disappearing waters of the Indus may one day trigger a conflict among these three nuclear powers that could transform the world. And then there are the stories that could be told about how Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai has returned to her native country as we speak, a couple of days ago, visiting Pakistan's flood-hit areas to call the world's attention to the terrible humanitarian crisis, her website calls it. In how many ways can the stories of the Indus be told, and to what ends? So Pakistan is one of the places that I'm particularly concerned about. This afternoon, a few scholars of the humanities who specialize in literature and anthropology, which straddles the line between the humanities and the social sciences, have gathered here to analyze and interpret the stories of others, questioning what is taken for granted, scrutinizing familiar terms and categories, interpreting the silences between words. Metaphors and tropes, resource development, victims in need of humanitarian aid, corrupt government, endangered species. These metaphors and tropes shape what we see and what we don't see. These tropes allow us to imagine some paths forward, but not others. Our speakers aim to help us recognize some of these assumptions and the constraints they impose, and thus to see other possible futures. Since you have the program before you, I won't take the time now to go through detailed introductions for each speaker, especially since we're starting a little later than I had planned. Each will speak for, 30 to 40 minutes, I guess we'll say, depending on what they've prepared for us, leaving some time for questions from the audience. But the main discussion will happen later. We will have our Columbia University discussants, Gayatri and Rosalind Morris from Anthropology, who will comment on the themes raised during the presentations, and there'll be also time for discussion at that point. Okay, so now I will introduce Nayanika Mathur, Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at the University of Oxford, and currently at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, where she's working on a new project that considers questions of method opened out by the climate crisis. She will be speaking today on Crooked Cats, Beastly Tales from the Indian Himalaya. Join me in welcoming.
Oh, I see that my slide's already there. Thank you, Kathy, for that introduction. Thank you to the South Asia Institute, and thank you to Professor Spivak for organizing this workshop. I can see that my slide is there, but I can't. Just want to check one thing. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be speaking today from my recently published book, Crooked Cats, Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene. Before I sort of launch into what this book is about and how it might intersect with some of the objectives of this workshop, I just want to share two anecdotes about this work. So when this manuscript first went out for review about 4 or 5 years back, so an early review of the book, one of the reviewers wrote back saying, I don't see what big cats have to do with the climate crisis. I don't understand why the Anthropocene is framing this work. Now, I'm hoping that by now this person would have revised the opinion. I think they have, because in the second round they seem to be a bit more convinced about it. But I think I go back to that review quite often to think about actually what the subtitle of this event is, Imagining Other Ways. Because one of the arguments in this work is that we don't need to have a causality between something like climate change and some of the things that we're seeing as anthropologists or historians or that we're writing about. But perhaps we need to reframe the way we look at the world or look at established fields, such as in my case, multi-species ethnography. The second sort of anecdote about it is that I actually wanted this subtitle for my book, Beastly Tales from the Anthropocene, originally, but my press and the editor decided that that sounds like a work of fiction rather than anthropology, and they sort of suggested this Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene. And again, I think that is quite telling because of what counts as fiction, what counts as anthropology, what counts as social science research, how do we write narratives. These are things that I'm sort of very interested in exploring in this work, and especially questioning the idea of how we write ethnography in this moment. So this is the book. Now, the reason I was interested in talking about Beastly Tales, and that's something that I'm going to explain what I mean by that in this talk, is because actually this book emerged quite serendipitously. We were talking about this over lunch. This is not something I was necessarily interested in working in. It actually begins life back in 2006 when I just started my PhD, and I was working in this North Indian state called Uttarakhand. And I was working in a district called Chamoli, which sits on India's border with Tibet. And at that time, I was really interested in understanding the everyday state. I was interested in understanding bureaucratic processes. And I was working within, district offices. I was looking at the translation of law into practice. Very early in my fieldwork, I remember in this sort of very cold Himalayan winter morning, this leopard turned up in the town that I was living in, which is called Gopeshwar. And she turned out to be what's popularly called a man-eater. And she spread what was described as a reign of terror for about 3 months. She killed about 7 to 9 people. It's hard to get an exact number of how many she killed, but she injured a lot of people till she was eventually hunted down by a local shikari, a local hunter called Lakpat Singh Rawat. Now, this was the first crooked cat I came to intimately know, to sense, to feel, and fear. I never mercifully saw her until after she was gone, but I felt her presence almost constantly. Through her pug marks, the corpses and injuries left behind, the dogs and other animals that suddenly vanished, her beastly chinghar, or a scream-like roar that she would let out in the middle of the night, through gossip, rumor, jokes, the taste of fear, and the hair that stood up on the back of my neck. So overwhelming was her presence that I actually began to maintain what I call my bark diary, or my big cat diary, which sat alongside my fieldwork notes, which was my regular doctoral fieldwork, or as I then thought of it, and my personal diary. So none of us ever knew beyond a modicum of doubt why the leopard of Gopeshwar, or the Gopeshwar Wala Bagh as she was called, went off the straight and narrow path and she became crooked or tera by attacking and eating humans. However, everyone was certain that human actions had something to do with her and her crooked behavior. We were all extremely terrified of her, but we were also contradictorily somewhat in awe of her. So something that I can't ever sort of forget from my doctoral fieldwork is actually the amount we talked about her, and the kind of the gossip and this constant chatter about her, a lot of which has sort of made its way into this book as well. So when she was finally killed, we celebrated, we felt a sense of overwhelming relief, but many people also sort of shed a silent tear. Her corpse was paraded on a forest department jeep with a red mark, a tilak, on her forehead. And again, we can go into sort of some of the imagery around this and how it mimics a particular colonial account of hunting. I talk a bit about that in the book, and I'll come to it a bit towards the end. But what I want to actually talk about here is this idea of crookedness and what I mean by crooked cat. So I was told in the mountains that there are actually 2 types of big cats. There are those that are Siddha Sada, or the simple, the straightforward, and they're as scared of humans as we are of them, or at least they respect us and they want to stay away from us. And such leopards, such Bagh, which is the vast majority of leopards, tigers, and lions, actually know how to deal with humans. They are careful to avoid any unpleasant encounters. They stay away from them. So they're totally fine, and they actually inhabit this landscape in large numbers, quite not really what we might imagine given the narrative on extinction and endangerment. But leopards in particular, what's called the common leopard or the ordinary leopard in the Himalayas, actually is a very healthy population of them up in the mountains. But the problem really lies with another type of bug or another type of big cat, and these are those that have become tamed up. And these are popularly known as man-eaters, and they actively prey on humans. The questions that sort of set off this work, and which I'm going to very quickly try to answer here, not obviously in the entirety, but very briefly, is I got interested in this question of what makes a big cat crooked. How do humans come to recognize and intimately know a crooked cat? How does one live beside such beasts? And what might they have to do with the climate crisis and life in the Anthropocene, or even more perplexingly, with disciplinary boundaries, methodologies, and the question of how academic writing intervenes in the world? So these are just some of the questions that emerge directly from the beastly tale of the leopard of Gopeshwar. There is no resolution forthcoming. There is no forensic clarity on why big cats become crooked and make prey of humans. There is no attempted prescription on how we can fix this rather unique problem. What I write off instead are tales of multi-species encounters that seek to ask new questions emerging from an ethnographic grounding in India, while a planet in crisis looms large in the background. Okay, so early on in my research on crooked cats, I met a young man at a tea stall at a dhaba in a small town in the central Indian Himalaya. Shuddering slightly, and so this man had one arm amputated, and this was because of an attack by a leopard. So I sort of asked him about this, and he told me, and we had these extensive sort of conversations around that particular leopard that had attacked him and led to the amputation. So he described the whole sort of scene to me. He had been, a few years back, he'd been walking home from a friend's house when this big cat suddenly appeared from nowhere and dug its teeth into his right arm. It was early evening, there was still enough people around, so some people came and, he created a din and they managed to, and the leopard ran away. However, in the process, his arm was badly injured and it had to be amputated in its entirety. So all through a conversation, he kept gesturing with his left hand to the prominent absence on the right side of his body. Now, I'm going to quote from bits from my interview with him, and I'll come back to this. And so the first question I asked him, as I used to ask many people, was so why do you think, they go crooked? Why do you think they attacked you? And so his answer to me was well, do you know why he did it? He did it because he has no food left for himself up here in the mountains. Everything here is dying: the forests, the rivers, the soil, the animals. The only living being left are us humans, and even we won't last here for much longer at the rate things are going. And the reason for all of this is that they, and by they he was referring to the Indian state and to elites from the plains, so they come here they cut our trees, they steal our minerals, they steal our water, they rob us of all that rightfully belongs to the mountains. Our rivers are dammed to generate power for the air conditioners in their own houses in the cities and of the plains, while most of our villages remain unelectrified. They drive around in the big cars, but they don't even bother to build roads for us up here. The industries spew out all this filth which comes up here to ruin the environment. We're being eaten up alive by leopards and tigers, but even then they remain more concerned with saving the life of big cats than our human life. And he said, I don't blame this Adamkhor, this man-eater, but I do blame our sarkar, state, for there's nothing but a paper tiger. And so, and then he went on to also have this sort of whole historical account of how this kind of violence in the Himalayas has been happening for a long time, including from the time of the British, Angrezon ke zamane se. But it is only becoming worse and worse with the current state of Indian democracy. And there was a sort of lot of railing against Indian democracy and what that entails. There was also a naming of particular kinds of individuals, like an Ambani or Adani, Reliance Industries, JP Industries. There were very specific names which were sort of given in this. And so I've sort of put this together in one particular kind of paragraph. But the point I used this early interview because it was very illustrative of similar narratives across the Himalaya. When I would ask residents of the mountains about crooked cats, they would refer to human actors and historically shaped political structures. The presence of an exploitative state that is only interested in furthering the interests of its own narrow coterie of powerful and wealthy people, all living in the distant plains of India, was particularly stressed. This state does not care if human lives are being brutally lost and is interested only in the exploitation and expropriation of the rich natural resources of the mountains. mere lip service is paid to the need to conserve big cats. And, and there was this whole sort of very interesting critique of conservationism as well, and, who's, of big cat conservation, and whose lives are they interested in saving and whose are they not, which sort of mimics some of the work you see in the Sundarbans, say, by the anthropologist Anu Jale, who also talks about how, people just talk about how the tigers' lives are valued much more than human lives. There was also a very interesting account of empire, where there was a lot of talk about, what used to happen during the time of the British Raj, and there were all these talks of internal colonialism, which is again a very prominent narrative in the Himalaya, especially in a new state like Uttarakhand, where they talk about the Indian state as another colonizing state, and actually worse than the previous colonizers because of the kind of resource extraction that you see now. There were metaphors of death, of destruction, of predation endings, and of being swallowed or eaten alive that were omnipresent, as was a sense of deep time. A sympathetic stance towards big cats, towards crooked cats, was discernible once they had been killed or captured, that is, with elaborate theories propounded to explain why they do what they do. There were rich accounts of individual named big cats, alive and dead, that were narrated. So there's this whole sort of also emphasis on individualizing the species, on biographies almost of individual leopards or tigers that sort of animate this landscape. But the real beast of the tale in the majority of the tellings was not the offending leopard or tiger, but rather certain types of humans. So I talk a bit about how these accounts rippled with anger. There was beauty, there was humor, there was a deep sort of historical sensibility, an ecological consciousness, and very sharp political analyses. And what I try to do in this work is I weave these stories together to claim that they're powerful depictions of life in the Anthropocene, paying careful attention to the connections that they trace, their logics and poetics, and the regimes of governance and intimacies they emerge from, allows us, I think, to productively deploy the concept of the Anthropocene. So in Crooked Cats, I locate beastly tales at the very center of a series of cascading questions. First, and quite simply, how does one understand the phenomenon of crooked cats in India today? Leading on from this, how might the beastly tales of crooked cats deepen our understanding of the causes, consequences, and conceptualization of the climate crisis? And finally, how do they open out debates on the Anthropocene? And what I try to show again in the longer work is that beastly tales illuminate the Anthropocene in three critical ways: as method, as a way of reframing human-non-human relations on the planet, and as a political tool indicating the urgency of academic engagement. Now, I term the stories that this book is built on beastly tales, for they're about beasts of all forms. They're about tigers, lions, leopards, humans, the state, capitalists, bureaucrats, hunters, poachers, bears, dogs, monkeys, gods, demons. I mean, they're all part of it. But this phrasing is also a play on the question, and this is a question that, would come up all the time. Who is the real beast in the Anthropocene? Is it the crooked cat, or is it certain types of humans, such as being industrialists or members of the Indian state? Or is the beast, is it a god? Is it a demon? Is it Mother Nature or Prakriti, who's furious at the state of the planet? And this was sort of a play that you kind of see coming up in a lot of these narratives. And eventually, the other reason I use the term beastly tale and I find it productive is because this book or this work itself, or I would say ethnographic writing in this moment, itself is a kind of a tale, right? Because it is one way of narrating the Anthropocene, one that is no doubt guided by my own idiosyncratic understanding of what the real story is. And animals, of course, have always been a particularly effective mode of relating the world, especially when they act as protagonists in their own story. And of course, as most of you would have guessed, this phrase is, Beastly Tales is borrowed with immense gratitude from the writer Vikram Seth, who has an utterly delightful collection of poems entitled Beastly Tales from Here and There. And Seth's book contains 10 animal tales, all in verse form, taken from around the world, including India, China, Greece, Ukraine, and the mythical land of Gup. All 10 are morality tales that rest on unlikely animal relationships, such as between a crocodile and a monkey or an elephant and a tragopan. And these relationships that are part of Crooked Cats, because this is also about talking about specific kind of relationships, are a bit different. So I talk about the relationship between paperwork and statecraft, between surveillance cameras and emotion, between space and evidence, and between history, ethnography, and fiction. And these are, somewhat more mundane and less poetic than what Seth is writing about, but I hope they can also be illustrative in one form or the other. Now, again, this will be, this is sort of, it feels like a banality to state this, but I feel like I have to, partly in response to reviewer 2, but also partly to explain what work the climate crisis is doing, why I got interested in that, and why I think I can't tell this story outside the framing of the climate crisis. Human-animal relationships the world over are being profoundly shaped and changed by the ecological breakdown. Many of the central themes of my research that are intimately linked to a changing planet. And I should say I started work on this in 2006 in a way, and this book came out only late last year. In these 15 years, I can see so many things that have, for instance, the bewildering rise in attacks on humans by cats, the changing behavior of crooked cats that is being captured on cameras, CCTVs, television, and it's evidenced in acts such as the increasing entry into urban, heavily populated sites. Sort of just the data that we have to hand on species extinction, on endangerment, and of course with the tiger in a particularly vulnerable position. There are also sort of increasing struggles in South Asia, not just in the Himalaya, but in South Asia, with conservationism, with what's called development, with, again, this audience would be very familiar with a lot of these struggles. So in that sense, the climate crisis enters empirically as a fact that can no longer be turned away from and is an urgent need of acknowledgement. Now, there is, of course, a very long history to crooked cats in India, as I'm constantly reminded of by people who are like, well, what's new about this? There was always, you can't work in this region of the Himalaya without Jim Corbett sort of looming large and his stories taking over the space. And of course, the very image and narratives of man-eating tigers and the hunting down were central to British colonial representations of India, as several people have by now written on. There's also this sort of emerging and very powerful and important rich tradition of studying the environment and wildlife of India. It's produced some wonderful works on the relationship between humans and non-human animals, including on big cats. I'm not going to run through some of this literature here. Again, I'm assuming some of you are familiar with this. I draw upon that literature, but my one point of departure, I would say, from it is that I suggest that the time has come to locate climate change squarely in the middle of discussions on human-animal relations, and I ask how we might re-see and re-comprehend them in light of the Anthropocene. So to do so, to sort of this kind of re-seeing or this retelling, or in the words of this workshop, this imagining other ways, I think it requires a transformation in how we narrate the story of human-animal relationships, as well as the plot line, and who or what the main protagonists are. This new form of storytelling also requires what we can perhaps call an agnostic stance towards the boundedness of both disciplines and the subfields, such as, say, environmental anthropology or wildlife history or more than human geography. The concept of the Anthropocene, again, we can discuss how I use this concept perhaps in the Q&A, but I think if it is exploited to its full potential, if it is used politically, if it is used critically, it does open up a new way of working within and across disciplines. I think it can entail, and in my reading it does entail, a questioning of long-standing modes of describing the world, in this specific case of describing relationship between humans and big cats in India. As the late Bruno Latour stated in his account of politics in the new climatic regime, an answer to the despondent question of what is to be done is, quote, first of all, generate alternative descriptions, end of quote. So on the question of descriptions, this is something that I'm also, even in my earlier work, I've been sort of obsessed with. How do you describe certain social worlds as an ethnographer, whether it's the very mundane everyday life of the state, or it's the most spectacular and slightly exoticized world of, these charismatic endangered animals that are turning on humans in the Himalaya. How do we generate these descriptions? And I want to note something that is overwhelming, which really marks this out for me as quite separate and quite different from my earlier work, or from some of the anthropological writing I read, is that it's very uncertain and speculative. And I think that this uncertainty and speculative nature is something that we need to write into the climate crisis. So every chapter in this book is speculative. It opens out several possible theories. It offers case studies. It has what I think of as informed musings. This work sits uneasily with the production of an overarching and authoritative explanatory narrative that is oftentimes expected of academic writing. So this unease is partly a reflection of the temporality and form of my fieldwork. As I said, I've been working on this for 15 years and in different ways. And often I've sort of come to it serendipitously rather than concentratedly in the way one does, say, for one's DPhil. But I think it's not that. I think why it is a slightly uncertain tale, it's a speculative tale, is because this is how big cats or crooked cats are discussed. They're discussed through recourse to speculation, to guesswork, through the proffering of theories, through analyses of cases, through gesturing to historical examples, and by leaning on biographical details. And these are biographical details of big cats as much as of humans. And this is why, in a way, I also got interested in the literature and the Anthropocene, because I think the methodological impulse of that work is also a fluid movement between different bodies of knowledge and between the boundedness that unfortunately seems to have crept into a lot of academic writing. Now, let me return to the Himalaya. Now, all my interlocutors, and this is like actually a universal fact, if you're talking of fact, whether it's a conservationist or it's a resident of the Himalaya or it's a hunter or it's the poachers I spoke to, they all claim that there is a massive spike in unusual actions and quote-unquote visits of big cats in recent times. And again, when I talk about this, I'm asked for data in terms of stats or like numbers or something hard which people can understand. And my answer is always like, actually, I can't do that because there is an unreliability or absence of data for all of India for the longue durée. There are, the colonial accounts stop at a particular time. They themselves are very faulty. The post-colonial state has very different ways of organizing statistics. It varies by states. In Uttarakhand itself, the state I know the best, they have changed how they measure it. My own experience of living in spaces where the crooked cat shows that actually the data is deeply faulty. I mean, the state accounts do not even capture one iota, 1/10 of what is happening, right? But beyond the unreliability of data, mapping this out would also involve relying on a very particular form of knowledge, which is the quantitative or the statistical as a mode of persuasion. My ambition is to instead rely on beastly tales to do this labor of convincing for us. I take very seriously the universal claim among my interlocutors that big cats are acting in ways that are increasingly considered out of character. And again, in Uttarakhand, which is the state I work in, it is known to have the highest number of attacks on humans by leopards and tigers in India, and this claim is widely accepted. So this book opens with, but why is this happening? And I'm not going to have time to sort of go into some of these theories here or, some of the sort of stories around it here, rather. But from among a range of possible overlapping explanations, I do argue that the climate crisis is a central factor and we cannot write that out. Now, it is difficult, and as I ultimately argue, unnecessary to separate out the various theories to claim that there is a singular or a causal explanation for why animals are considered to be becoming more violent than before. There are many unknowns in the story of crooked cats. In fact, this work was birthed out of the uncertainty that characterizes the presence and spread of crooked cats. And it's this uncertainty that leads to this very dense proliferation of beastly tales of the form that I sort of am obsessed with. There's also this whole question of how do you come to know a non-human that you actually never see. So I've been working in this, you see them through WhatsApp things. You see them in other ways, through material remnants that they leave behind, or you can hear them. But this is not like my earlier work where I worked with, middle-aged male bureaucrats. Like I was sitting with them and working on files. This is a very different kind of a subject, so to say. So the only way you sort of get to know them is through stories or through these particular accounts of them in a way, right? And it's not just an anthropologist, but conservationists, the state, wildlife biologists, etc. They all have to sort of construct a narrative around them. What I also find interesting, and that's something that is a big theme in this work, is that despite the absence of firm knowledge, the state and conservationists have to behave as if they're certain, and they have to behave and act in accordance with unbending rule books. So this acting with certainty in the face of something that remains relatively unknown is a conundrum that lies at the very heart of what I discuss as the government of big cats. Now, as Kelly et al. Have noted, quote, ignorance and uncertainty never describe a generic absence of knowledge, but they always refer to a highly specific form of unknowing, end of quote. Now, I'm also interested in several forms of unknowing around crooked cats and the means through which concerned humans attempt to arrive at greater certainty. So I should say that when I'm referring to uncertainty unknowns, it isn't to depict my interlocutors as ignorant or somehow lacking. Rather, it is to highlight the tentative, affective, and situational knowledges that are in operation. It is also to highlight how formal institutions of governance and conservation refuse to acknowledge the fact that they, in truth, function through such uncertain knowledge practices, and yet they demand, more often than not, they work to actively manufacture legible knowns. Okay, so there may be many unknowns around why big cats go crooked, but it is now indisputable that anthropogenic climate change is central to species extinction. It is widely accepted that we are now living through what has been termed the sixth mass extinction. So on the one hand, what you have is there's a gathering scientific and conservationist consensus that establishes climate change and its effects quite centrally as factors affecting human-animal relations, especially but not limited to extinction and species endangerment. And of course, it's important to not disregard this emergent body of knowledge, which had not been at hand in this form for many of the earlier studies on why humans and big cats have come to clash. So, even as I speak, you have these new studies coming. People keep sending me these articles out in Science and Nature and, like particular kinds of things which back up some of the claims on what they describe as human-animal conflict. At the same time, it remains crucial to not let such legitimized, quote-unquote, scientific work entirely dictate how we understand the question of human-animal relations in a rapidly changing world. And so my attempt here is really to do this sort of very delicate balancing act. The task, as I see it, is not to somehow add the science onto the ethnography, but rather to think about what happens to history, ethnography, politics, and literature when climate science is written into the humanities and social sciences. What happens when, in lieu of being led by the science or through a reliance on numbers and graphs, we enfold these different ways of comprehending the world one into the other. Additionally, we need to recognize that seemingly scientific accounts are themselves derivative of the stories we choose to tell about the world. So, as Ursula Heiss has argued, biodiversity, endangered species, and extinction are primarily cultural issues, questions of what we value and what stories we tell, and only secondarily issues of science. The story around changing human-animal relations and the increase in what is termed conflict has taken on a very particular form, and it's it's congealing into a very particular form. One in which the natural sciences and conservationist voices are taking a lead in, and I'm not going to have time here to etch out that narrative, but perhaps we can discuss it later. My ambition is something different, is to basically center ethnographic knowledge or forms of storytelling and foreground that in it. So, and I should say that for the last 3 years, I've been working on a research network at the university that I teach in, which is called Climate Crisis Thinking in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And our ambition is this, that we actually try to get climate scientists and historians and humanities scholars and social scientists to sit at the same table and talk about similar issues. And it's quite challenging, let me put it that way, but also fascinating in terms of what happens when you try to weave these knowledge forms together. Okay, I'm coming towards an end, but let us just once again consider the snippet from that interview with the person who had lost a limb to a big cat. It is my claim that he, as well as the other interlocutors whose accounts I sort of work in, have sort of tried to write up, is referring to the Anthropocene and factors that are contributing to the climate crisis, but just not in the very same register. While the narratives emanating from victims and their families might not actually utilize the term climate change or climate crisis, all the practices that they speak of are the ones that contribute to anthropogenic climate change. When discussing crooked cats, Himalayan residents speak of history of capitalism, of inequality, of power, of retribution, and non-human migration and capture. And these accounts do not speak in the abstract. So it's not like an article in a science journal, for instance, but they work through more embodied and impassioned rhetorical styles. So what I'm trying to argue here is that differences in tone and content shouldn't, however, blind us to these narratives' overlapping claims. Just as critical work on climate change shows how the local is folded into the global, so too do the alternative stories in the Indian Himalaya draw our attention to inequality and active marginalization, albeit within the nation-state of India. Furthermore, the utilization of metaphors of death, of destruction, of endings in these localized narratives bear very strong affinity to more mainstream narratives on catastrophic climate change, including for this new sort of world that we're seeing of cli-fi, of climate fiction. You can sort of see echoes of it in some of these stories. Sort of the last point I want to make is that these beastly tales that I wrote of initially perplexed me for one reason. So when a crooked cat was in the vicinity, most people wanted him or her killed or captured at the earliest. And there was a preference for the death of the animal. And this was often quite brutal. I've shown you some of the more sort of sanitized images of it, but there were often quite brutal accounts of hacking the animal down, of hunting the big cat down in a way. But at the very same time, especially with the passage of time, and you would go back to these spaces, there was a sympathetic stance that you would see towards the same beast. So the cat was often referred to as bichara, as a poor thing, or as bekasur, as innocent. And what I want to argue here is that these contradicting narratives on crooked cats can coexist because people who live in close proximity to them are conscious that the crookedness is not the doing of an individual, but rather emerges from longer-term structures and human actions. In the heat of the terrified moment, they wish to do away with the individual, but are aware that the blame lies on the doorstep of us humans. And again, the category of humans is parsed out carefully. There are several specified types of humans who are singled out as responsible for this horrific state of affairs. There is no undifferentiated we of humankind that is invoked here. Rather, there is a clear understanding of power and social stratification along lines of caste, class, gender, age, location, and race. Climate change, as has been well argued by now, is notoriously hard to pin down to just one thing, to clearly see and to articulate coherently. And there is a great difficulty, too, in making the complex interconnections across time and scale that then allow it to be brought into visibility. It is also hard to clearly identify who all are responsible for this crisis, given the gesturing to vastly depersonalized systems like capitalism or consumerism. And so one of my claims here is that the stories, these beastly tales of crooked cats recounted here, do this intellectual work of pulling together disparate elements that allow us to experience and fathom the climate crisis in a unique way. But this requires a receptiveness to the message in the beastly tales, a willingness to trace the connections that explain our current planetary predicament through the peculiar phenomena of big cats that make prey of humans in India. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. You can sit there. I think we need people to, we either need to pass a mic or, yeah, where's the mic?
Oh, I think this, oh,
yeah. Yeah, does anybody have a question before? Okay, do you want to come up and somehow get hold of a mic?
Okay, should I just go there? I just want to mute.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me through the mask? Yes. Thank you so much for the really illuminating talk. I was wondering, you were speaking a little bit earlier about attitudes towards the Indian state, and I was wondering in your research if people's political affiliations had any effect on their attitudes towards big cats.
Should I answer or should I be taking? Okay. Maybe, I don't know how to unmute this, so maybe I'll just go back up.
I think.
Oh, you can hear me? Yeah, okay, great.
It happens for us.
Oh, it happens for us, okay. Okay, magically. Okay, great. You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for your question. It's a good question. I think that one of the things which I find interesting in some of this work on climate change, again, I'm speaking very much from Uttarakhand and the Himalaya, which is the region I know the best, is that there is a huge overlap between what the BJP and the Congress, which are the two big parties, political parties, their attitude towards infrastructure, towards environment, their relations with the big capital, their attitude towards the mountains. And what you can see is that you can see that actors between the BJP and the Congress constantly move between one and the other. So, I'm finding it hard to keep up with local politics in terms of, is this man now still in the BJP or has he moved to the Congress? And so I think that if I was to really answer this question, I would say that I don't really necessarily see a difference between in the state, in terms of which government is in power. There are some small things here and there where you can sort of see a difference in terms of who are they close to in terms of the big capitalists. So is Adani getting this contract or is Ambani getting it? You can see that there, but in terms of the kind of imagination of what is development, what the Himalaya is, basically it's a resource frontier. It's a space for extraction. I don't see that much of a difference. I think the only thing I would say on the question of the politics is that with the BJP entrenching its sort of hold in the Himalaya, the narrative on Hindutva is becoming much, much more strong, and that's leading to a very particular kind of infrastructure development around temples and yatras and pilgrimages and what happens there, which has its own ecological effects. And I think I haven't done that work of tracing that out, as perhaps I ought to, but I haven't done that quite yet, but that's quite clear. But in terms of people, like in terms of people I've worked with, it's sort of, I haven't necessarily seen a difference in political leaning or party affiliation changing the way in which they talk about, sorry, you're there. Yeah, they talk about climate crisis. But I think it's a great question, and I need to think more about it. Thank you.
Yes. Mike. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Anthropocene and the problematics with the term Anthropocene that, I teach a course on environment, and we say that all the time. So if you could say a little bit more, because you said we could ask in the question and answer, the differentiation of the anthropos, of the Anthropocene, and how you take into account those differentiations on capital and all of that. And even the human and the non-human, because these are beastly cats. And so I'm thinking of the Feral Atlas, the project by Stanford University Press. So how do you differentiate it? How do you take into account the human and non-human? And then also just quickly, you mentioned that there is a project where there's science and non-science people, dismantling the boundaries between humanities studying the human world and then sciences doing the natural world. How does that account into this term Anthropocene? I'm really interested in pushing it a little more before we move on.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, I should say that in the beginning, I was so critical of the concept Anthropocene. My first paper on this was like this damning critique of how it is so Eurocentric, it is so white, it doesn't account for global inequalities, it doesn't account for history, it doesn't make space for particular kinds of knowledge forms to be part of it. And so I kind of rejected that concept entirely. But as I started working more and thinking more about it, and especially as I started, I think the two reasons why I turned to the Anthropocene and how it figures in this. One of the reasons is that I think it allows, I'm more and more obsessed with this idea of interdisciplinarity, including this project that I mentioned to you, which is what my current work is also in this research network I'm sort of co-directing in my university. I'm sort of interested in this question of interdisciplinarity, but not in the older sense of, let's have a history in anthropology, but a sort of almost like a new form of knowledge around this. And I think the Anthropocene as a method opens up that space for that if it is used well. And I can think of some examples where it is used well. So I think, for instance, Anna Singh with her argument on the Apache Anthropocene or the Feral Atlas is a very good example of the kind of work or the productivity of something like that, which can come from it. And that's why I changed my opinion on it. But the other reason that I find the Anthropocene useful is actually for the kind of the multi-scalar thinking that it allows for. So, that same evil reviewer too was like, but this is just about the Himalaya. This is just about India. This is just about that particular region of the world. And I would dispute that, because I don't think we can anymore talk about somehow the local outside this, the scale of the region of the global, right? But the question is, how do we do that kind of scale shifting, which, again, I think the Anthropocene opens out. So that's why I sort of got interested in that. This research network is really an experiment which is failing horribly, which is getting together people, to like, these are people who contribute to the IPCC, but they're also like Latinists and poets and artists and anthropologists like me sitting there, and we have these roundtable discussions. We're co-writing a paper actually that we've just submitted to Nature. I'm sure they'll reject it, but we've tried it, arguing about what is climate science and how should we think about what climate science is. So it's coming out of that kind of a thinking, and which I personally think is opened out by the Anthropocene concept.
Now we have quite a few questions.
I think we should cut the postdoc discussions short if we want to give time to
Yeah, so why don't we get some questions out here, and then...
Okay, I wanted to just bring to the awareness of people the importance of what we call development, capital D. It's not only poets and artists and anthropologists and academics, etc. I've been working for the last a little over a decade with development people, and I, in fact, am quite often the only humanities person in these World Bank IMF things by invitation, because there's always a good person there who wants this to happen. So nothing happens. But anyway, I've been working with development folks, trying to tell them precisely, it's a very good point that your group is making, that I work specifically in Africa with the rural-urban interface, that one should not have questions, but one should actually learn to listen. So, and as they speak, from moments in what they say, draw up leading questions like women were taught to do with men, and so on and so forth, so that the agency goes to them, etc. These people have not even heard of Irving Goffman, so we are not really talking. I mean, Goffman's work, even though it happened so long ago, it's very interesting in terms of how to interview and how to bring out narratives, etc. It hasn't really grown old. I was surprised as I was talking to these people who are very learned, some of them, about Goffman, really undergraduate stuff. I was very surprised. So to an extent, I just wanted to bring to everyone's awareness that we cannot just talk about academic material when we are talking about statistics. You did mention that the government of India really produces statistics. I mean, one could exchange horror stories, how they produce statistics. But the thing is that statistics are not bad things. The usefulness of statistics is so immense in the development sector that I believe imagining otherwise, we have to imagine the diversity of the development sector, starting from development workers, some rather sort of good-hearted, etc., as they go up into the global organizers of development. I just wanted to make this comment, because otherwise that academic stuff, artists and so on, artists sometimes are so full of credulous vanity that you want to die. I have a lot to do with artists. So they talk a lot to museums and curators. So I think just as a much older person, I would just contribute that thought before other people begin to speak. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we get a few other questions out?
I think that lady has been waiting for a while. I don't know there.
Oh,
Just like...
yeah. But let's get the... Yes. Oh, sorry. No, I think we need the mic. Yeah.
It's recording.
If you don't mind being recorded.
Yeah. So the mic is partly for us to hear and partly for posterity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nayanika. I had a question about, when you think about particularly Chamoli and the longer history of Chipko, I was wondering how much of this story is a story of change versus continuity, because I think there's been a much longer history of many of the anecdotes you recount could have also been anecdotes that have, that could have been articulated then. Right. The notion of, a legacy of colonialism, the Indian state being kind of an oppressor state, and various things. So what has really changed? And then I wanted to respond to what Dr. Spivak was also saying, that it's true that development experts don't work in isolation. They often get people on board who are from the humanities. And I mean, the last head of the World Bank was Jim King, who was an anthropologist. So it's not that they don't bring anthropologists and others in. The question is, how do they see the humanities as offering a space for certain kinds of intervention? And it's in the sphere of what they see as an intervention science, where they kind of project the need for certain kinds of data, which is where I think when we suggest things from the humanities, they don't see the numbers. So I think there's an act of translation here between the stories and myths and narratives to what are seen as interventions. And some people have tried to do that, but I feel that's one of the things. It's not the lack of exposure to the other imaginaries. I think it's the perception of what development as a paradigm has. It's very narrow, how it represents itself. So I think we need to kind of make it less of a binary between us and them. That's what I thought. But the first question was about change and continuity.
Yeah, thanks. And then we have a question here.
I actually had a very similar question, which was just about, given the sort of international reliance on very quantitative reports like the IPCC, how do you make that first move and that first step to sort of reconcile what you were saying about ethnography and these like beastly tales?
You want to quickly add a few words and then we'll...
one more person.
Oh,
was the one?
Okay, sorry, I missed you.
Hi, thanks. I was really interested in your preoccupation with beastly tales. And I found it interesting that at points you kind of juxtaposed it with the quantitative and the scientific. And I find that interesting because I work in an interdisciplinary space between anthropology and ecology. And it's interesting because actually in conservation science, there is a lot of space actually for the speculative. And they're permitted to be speculative because there's an expectation that afterwards a kind of technical armature will be provided that will then kind of embolden and inhabit the speculative and turn it into the concrete. And so I guess I wondered, to what extent do we need to start thinking about the epistemological ordering in who is permitted and what subjects are permitted to be speculative, and whether or not we have to internally look at ourselves within anthropology and our attempt to professionalize and, I guess, legitimize our stories and our tales that's actually hampering our ability to be speculative along with everyone else.
Yeah, really great. Do I answer? Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, very quickly, and then maybe we can have longer conversations later. Thank you for these three excellent questions. I might begin with the last one. When I was talking about the speculative stories, I wasn't at all saying that speculation is not there in other fields. I was saying that the speculative for me in my writing as an ethnographer, and I was contrasting it to my earlier work, which was on the state and bureaucracy, which was, I had maybe I was just younger and, I just had very firm arguments on what I was arguing. But I pick up this question of speculation, uncertainty, because the moment I saw that in my writings, or say when you go for peer review, when you're presenting this work, the speculative nature of some of it is seen as a way in which you can then dismiss it as saying, actually, this is not scientific, this doesn't actually talk about the planetary crisis, this is actually just stories. So I think that's what I meant by speculation, and you're absolutely right that it is in the world of ecology and in conservation science, there's a lot of sort of speculative writing around what's happening, especially when it comes, I think, to charismatic and endangered megafauna. So I wasn't at all trying to claim that it's just me doing that. It was more in contrast to, or that other sciences don't do that. It was more in contrast to some other claims. But thank you for that. I might then come to yours because in a way it's linked. And, so this is it. We work with, in this network that I work on, I am working with two people who were lead authors in IPCC reports. One of them is a hard scientist, and the other is sort of a socio-economic thing. And then I'm then a colleague of mine is a historian, and there's a literature person. And so we're sort of the five core people in this. And, it's really hard. I mean, because they want different... I can give you an example of the heat waves in South Asia, which are going on in Pakistan and India, etc. And so one of our colleagues is someone who's actually done the quant work, which is then appearing in all the IPCC reports and actually in the Indian media as well. Her name is Freddie Otto, and Freddie's been doing this work, leading this research on showing the correlation between heat waves and climate change, and giving us those numbers which say climate change has made it 60% more likely that this heat wave that was caused in India in this time was caused by climate change. And so she does that kind of work. So when she listens to me talking to her, for instance, on the heat waves, about these stories of birds dropping dead from the sky, or of bears that have been maddened by the heat and are going and stealing things, she's just like, don't tell me this. Like, this has no space here. So what we're trying to do is sort of set up a dialogue and try to think about co-writing. That's the one thing that we're trying to do. And I don't see this necessarily falling into policy documents directly. And again, but I'm hoping that this shift in discourse, the kind of conversations we're having here, for instance, today, the kind of ways in which the environmental humanities is getting stronger, the way in which you have climate schools, etc., popping up everywhere. I hope these are spaces where we can develop these conversations. But again, like, great question. Thank you for your question on Chamoli and Chipko. And you're right. Like, I also initially was like, well, this is like, given that Chipko started in Chamoli, given that there is a long narrative here of environmental destruction, of internal colonialism, of resource extraction, being a resource frontier, etc., in a way, what is new? So I'll just quickly sketch out what I think is new. One is sort of and this is actually the title of my present project, is the ways in which people talk about death and ending. So they talk about how everything is ending, it's finishing. And you can see this in ways, for instance, I'll give you a very stark example. Rainy, the village in which Chipko actually started, is sinking. It's not inhabitable anymore. So everyone has to leave the village. They literally can't live there anymore. So you see this massive acceleration in change in terms of the ecological collapse is visible in the Upper Himalaya, in Chamoli, in ways that people there say it was not during the time of Chipko, right? Chipko, also the popular argument, and the one which I actually buy much more than some of the more romanticized images of it being, this like women coming and hugging trees, but like the more gritty argument which still pervades that space is that actually this was about resource extraction. It's about commercial timber farming. It was about taking resources away and not, again, a long history, exactly as you're saying, long colonial history, which was being resisted. And so, I don't want to, and I think again, this is a question that goes back to the stats when something I'm asked about, well, how much have they gone up? How much have they gone down? How do we measure change? How do we understand change? How do we talk about it? And these are really important questions. But I think my answer would be that I think that I, as an anthropologist, would say I talk about change in the ways in which people themselves narrate it as saying that things are khatam, they're finished, it's ended, right? And they did not, I think, have such apocalyptic narratives previously.
Okay, I won't take some, but I'll just quote Nayanika Mathur and then we'll talk about it. Nayanika is not particularly always following my work. One of them was, what I really like about Gayatri Spivak's following remark has to be remembered. It's okay, you feel that way, but who listens? That's what I was talking about. It's not particular corporations or anything. But when we have only one short life, when we are really trying to make change, then the group with whom we work to imagine otherwise, it is so much harder to persuade because the development sector is not monolithic. It's very multilithic. And we just have names of corporations and so on and so forth. That's what it was. Who listens? That's my question.